أستأذن سموكم بالبدء. صاحب السمو الشيخ محمد بن زايد آل نهيان ولي عهد أبوظبي نائب القائد الأعلى للقوات المسلحة، صاحب السمو الشيخ سعود بن راشد المعلى عضو المجلس الأعلى حاكم القيوين، أصحاب السمو الشيوخ، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، الحضور الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اسمحوا لي بالتعريف عن نفسي. أنا الدكتورة حواء السعيد سالم الضحاك المنصوري، استشارية الغدد الصماء والسكري، نائبة المدير في مركز إمبيريال كوليج لندن للسكري في أبوظبي. يسعدني ويشرفني في هذا المساء أن أتولى مهمة إدارة هذا الحوار في هذا الملتقى الفكري بمجلس محمد بن زايد آل نهيان. حضورنا الكريم، محاضراتنا اليوم تحت عنوان تأثير التجارب المبكرة على نمو الدماغ، يلقيها علينا الدكتور ديمتري كريستاكس. والآن اسمحوا لي بأن أكمل ما تبقى من حديثي معكم باللغة الإنجليزية. Media in the digital age, it's a powerful tool. Whether we are referring to TV, Twitter, video games, YouTube, or the latest app, it's everywhere. But is it a tool for good or is it a tool for bad? That perhaps depends on the way media is used and for what purpose. The audience might be interested to know that in the region, people spend on average 7.5 hours a day watching TV. This is one of the highest statistics in the world. From the UAE Internet Social and Mobile Statistics of 2015, the percent of the population that are active users of the Internet in the UAE is a staggering 92%. That's 8.8 million of the UAE population. This is significantly higher than countries even such as the US, UK, and Germany. Did we mention video games? A study concluded that about 60% of video games that were rated as suitable for all have significant amounts of violence. Because the child's brain is still under development, the influence of the digital information age may be lifelong. Therefore, we must be wary of its effects as it's become an integral part of our lives, especially here in the UAE. Here to speak to us about the subject of child development in our digital age is Dr. Dimitri Christakis, Professor and Director of the Center for Child Health Behavior and Development at Seattle Children's Research Institute. He has published over 200 research articles on the subject and authored a book as well. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Ramadan Mubarak. I want to start by expressing my deepest gratitude to His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed for inviting me into his Majlis. It is without a doubt the singular greatest honor of my life, so thank you. I want to thank everyone for coming, His Highness, Highnesses, Excellences, and honored guests. I have been to your country many times and have developed a profound affection for your people and your culture. This is the first time, however, that I have been blessed to be here during the holy month of Ramadan, and I've also been accompanied by my family, which makes it very special indeed. And with that, I will begin. I'm a pediatrician and epidemiologist, and my laboratory's mission is to determine modifiable factors in children's early environment that impact positively their cognitive, social, and emotional development, and to develop actionable strategies to optimize them. And because I have a limited time today, I'm going to focus on their cognitive development. Now, as was mentioned in the introduction, those of us that are over the age of 30, while we rely on technology regularly in our day-to-day lives, we came to it as adults. In fact, many refer to us as digital immigrants because we didn't grow up with these things, but we rely on them, and we can become very, very frustrated with our inability to use them effectively. In contrast, today's children are frequently referred to as digital natives because they are truly born immersed in a highly technologized world. And when we think about digital natives versus digital immigrants, you might notice some differences. The immigrants in us tend to be single task oriented. We think sequentially. We rely on text primarily. And we usually rely on a limited resource. But our children rely on multitasking, parallel thinking, multimedia, and multiple resources. Now, is this good? Is this bad? It's clearly very, very different than the world that we grew up in. And so today I'm going to spend some time talking about what I think the effects of that are and what my concerns are. Now, I'm going to frame this in the context of three concurrent phenomena of childhood. The first is brain growth. The second is the development of executive function. And the third is media exposure. So, beginning with brain growth. The typical newborn brain weighs 333 grams. In the first 2 years of life, it triples in size. It's an extraordinary period of brain growth. In fact, if you look at brain growth over the lifetime, as I show here graphically, you'll see there's a very, very steep rise in the first 3 years of life. In fact, it's not fully completed until early adulthood, around the age of 20 to 24. And if you look over to the right of that graph, you'll see where I am and why I had such a difficult time this morning finding my hotel key. But I'm not here to talk about the right side and those of us that are on the decay. I'm here talking about the ascendancy, where early children's brains are developing and how early experiences affect that. Now, we're born with a lifetime supply of neurons of brain cells. That's not where the growth comes. The growth comes in the connections between those brain cells, what we call synapses. And those synapses form based on early experiences. Everything a child experiences early on creates connections between brain cells. If you will, the mind is fine-tuned to the world children inhabit. So to give you an example of this that works in my culture, any child born anywhere in the world can speak any language fluently. But if they're not exposed to certain sounds early in life, they can learn to speak a language fluently, but they'll never pass as a native speaker. We all know such people. It's not because they weren't born with the capacity to make those sounds. It's because they grew up early on in a world where that sound didn't exist, and their brain essentially didn't bother to develop the capacity to make it, and the window closed, and they can never make it when they grow up. To illustrate this graphically, you can see here the neurons present at birth with the connections between them. And each brain cell at birth has about 1,500 connections. By 3 years of life, it's over 100,000 connections. And by 15 years of life, you can see that there's a gradual pruning as some pathways aren't being reinforced. To illustrate this another way, I show you here the breathing of a one-day-old infant listening to music. This is the breathing pattern. And first, Mozart is playing. And then Stravinsky comes on. And then Mozart again. Now, I show you this not to portray an infantile critique of classical music, but some of you who know classical music might have a theory for why Stravinsky did this to this poor infant's breathing pattern. I show you to demonstrate that there's a discernible physiological reaction in infants to what they're hearing, even on one day of life. This baby distinguishes between Mozart and Stravinsky. It makes her think differently. Now, the brain develops from the back to the front as we go from child to adulthood. And I'll show you that here. It'll be demonstrated by the blue. As the blue progresses, you'll see, starting in the back of the brain all the way to the front. And this is important because the areas of the brain serve different functions. So at birth, the back part of the brain is fully developed, and that's the part that controls vital functions such as swallowing, smooth movements and coordination, and audio and visual processing. Beginning at about 4 months, sensory and motor integration begin. At about 10 to 12 months, the limbic system, which is deep in the brain and controls emotions, starts. And this is why 4-month-olds are not capable of having temper tantrums, but 10 to 12-month-olds and 15-month-olds can have great ones. They're just starting to develop that emotional part of their brain, and in fact, before it's fully developed, they can't even control their emotions very, very well. 18 to 24 months, we see the development of the language centers, and finally, finally, the very front part of the brain we call the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for abstract thought, reasoning, judgment, and regulation of emotion. The most important part of the brain is the last part to develop. And I mentioned that that's the part that controls executive function, the most important thing that our brain does. And there are three components to executive function. The first is self-control, which is basically the ability to stay focused and to resist temptation, not to be distracted, to pay attention to something. The second is working memory, which is the ability to hold information in your hand while mentally working with it. And the third is what we call cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to apply something that you learned in one context in another. All three of these are important. But I believe very firmly, and I hope I can convince you of this, that self-control, the ability to stay focused, is the most important. Now, I'll illustrate this here somewhat comically. The question here is find X. And this person jumps and says, here it is. The reason they did that, not intending to be funny, is because they jumped too quickly. They didn't spend enough time thinking about what the question was asking and what the right answer was. Now, many years ago, about 30 years ago, there was a famous study done at Stanford called the Stanford Marshmallow Test. If it was done here in the UAE, it would probably be lukumats that they used. Marshmallows are very popular with young children, and they brought preschool children into the lab, and they set them there, and they told the child that they could have one marshmallow right now, or if they waited for 10 minutes, they could have two. And they walked out of the room, and they had a video camera recording the children. Only 20% of the children were able to wait the whole 10 minutes to eat the marshmallow and get the extra one. Some of them would take a little pinch out of the bottom and then try to hide it. Some of them would bite their knuckles to avoid it. They would try to look away to distract themselves. But the interesting thing was, the longer the children waited to bite that marshmallow, the better they did. The better they did in school, the better they did in life. That early self-control, that executive function that says to you, stay focused, I'm not going to eat the marshmallow, it's going to pay off in the long run, makes a difference. Now, that's a very cute study, but there's a lot of science that's backed it up. One famous study in Dunedin followed 1,000 children from birth to 30 years. And what they found was, as you can see here, child self-control in quintiles as a preschool child, low to high, and then look at the graphs there. Substance dependence, poor physical health, social economic status. I only show you these three. I could have showed you 30 others. The more self-control children have in childhood, the better off they are in their lifetime. All of this is driven by executive function. And in fact, executive function, as this graph shows, begins early in life, and you see the very, very steep rise there. So again, that early experience drives it, which has led many people to develop games, strategies to help children build executive function. This is a very simple one here. It's called Walk the Line. You take a piece of tape and you put it on a carpet, and you tell the child, walk on this line, put one step in front of the other. Now, you might think of this as being a test of physical ability, which it is, but it's also a test of cognitive ability. This child has to stay focused, not be distracted by what's going on around him, or he's going to step off the line. And the idea is that this kind of training can help the child not eat the marshmallow, stay focused on the task ahead. Which brings me to media exposure, the third concurrent phenomenon I want to talk about. This says, go to your chat room. We are technologizing childhood, as I mentioned before. In 1970, the typical age at which children began to watch television was 4 years, like this cute little girl there. And today, based on research that we've done, it's 4 months. Most of that switch hasn't happened in the last 40 years. Most of it has happened in the last 10. And in fact, if you look at children's daily media usage, children 0 to 6 spend about 2 hours a day with screen media. Children 6 to 18 spend about 5.5 hours a day. But that's only how much time they spend at home, and many of our children are cared for elsewhere or by others, not by parents. And when you add that to it, what we find is that the typical child, as was said, spends 6 to 7 hours a day on a screen. Now, keep in mind that preschool children are only awake for about 12 hours a day. So they're spending as much as 50% of their time in front of a screen. So the question that we've had, that I've posed here, are these three concurrent phenomenon: brain growth, executive function development, and media exposure occurring concurrently. What are the effects of that? Now, we've known for very long, that too little stimulation is bad for brain development. I show you here 2 PET scans. Now, the way you read a PET scan is the brighter the color, the more brain activity is going on. And on the left is a typical PET scan from a kindergartner, and on the right is a PET scan from a child that was raised in a Romanian orphanage, profoundly neglected, didn't get any stimulation at all. And you'll see there are areas of this child's brain that show no activity whatsoever. Because of that profound lack of stimulation, areas of his brain didn't develop. But the question that we've had in my lab for some time is, what about too much? Is it possible to overstimulate the developing brain? Is there good stimulation, bad stimulation? Too much stimulation can be harmful. And that brings me to Baby Einstein. I don't know if this exists actually in this country, but other DVDs for sure do for babies. And this is a clip from Baby Einstein, Day on the Farm. It's a 20-second segment, so watch. So in that 20-second segment, there were 7 scene changes. It makes no sense. If you're watching it, you're trying to make a coherent narrative as an adult, and you can't. It's completely discombobulated. But babies aren't capable of making a coherent narrative out of it cognitively. What's keeping them engaged in the screen is all of that change, that ridiculously, supernaturally fast pacing. That's not what going on a farm is like. And I want to contextualize this by talking about the rise of attention deficit disorder, which, as you may know, is characterized by impulsivity, inattention, and hyperactivity, really a deficit of executive function. Now, I looked, and there was a study in the University of Sharjah that showed that the prevalence of ADHD right now in the UAE is about 15%, which is actually very similar to other developed countries, very similar to what we see in the United States. The concerning thing is that ADHD is 30% more common today than it was 20 years ago. We've seen a rise in it. Children's attention spans have gone down over the last 20 years. Now, we've known for some time that ADHD has a genetic component. But I show you here many different studies that have looked at how heritable it is. And if you summarize them, it's about 75%, meaning that if one identical twin has ADHD, there's a 75% chance that their sibling will. If it were 100% genetic, of course, identical twins are identical genetically. They should both have it. So like many things, what we've come to realize about ADHD is that there are certain genes that interact with certain environmental influences that produce ADHD. In fact, the US Surgeon General said some time ago, for most children with ADHD, the overall effects of these gene abnormalities appear small, suggesting that non-genetic factors also are important. Now, in my research, I don't actually talk about ADHD, and here's why. If you think about attentional capacity as having a normal distribution, what we do as clinicians when we diagnose ADHD is we draw a line at the 95th percentile. And we say, if you're on this side of the line, you have ADHD. And if you're on this side of the line, we say you don't. But it's clear that that child has serious attentional challenges. And when I showed you self-control in adult outcomes, you may recall there was no threshold. It was a linear relationship. There wasn't some magic cut point at which early executive function mattered. And so there really shouldn't be a distinction that we draw here. And so many years ago, we came up with what we call the overstimulation hypothesis, and simply said that what that says is prolonged exposure to this rapid image change during this critical window of brain development preconditions the mind to expect that high level of stimulation. And this leads to inattention in later life. Put another way, you watch enough Baby Einstein Day on the Farm as a baby, and then when you go to a farm as a school-ager, it's so boring. How come it's so slow? Why do I have to walk here? Why don't things pop out at me like they do in Baby Einstein? And what we found was that the more television children watched before the age of 3, the more likely they were to have attentional problems at school age. The other thing we found was that the more cognitive stimulation children received early in life, the less likely they were to have attentional problems. And we measured cognitive stimulation by how often parents read to their children, sing to them, take them to museums, etc. In fact, each hour of TV that children watch before the age of 3 increased the risk of attentional problems by 10%. And each hour of cognitive stimulation that they received decreased the risk by 20%. So put another way, the child who watched 2 hours of TV a day before the age of 3, 20% more likely to have attentional problems at school age compared to the child who watched none. And if our hypothesis was correct, that it's this surreal pacing, that it's the overstimulation that drives this, you might imagine that what children watch matters. So we repeated our study, looking at what kids watch. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen the Powerpuff Girls movie, but I will show you a clip from the Powerpuff Girls movie. So that, again, you'll see the very fast pacing. In fact, this was the first movie that was rated PG for non-stop, frenetic animated action. I want to contrast that with a different program. This is from Mr. Rogers, and watch this segment.
Hi, Odd.
Oh, hi,
How are you?
Fred. I'm fine. How are you?
Good, thanks. I brought my television neighbor to see what a restaurant was like.
Oh, I'm so glad. Can I show you a table?
Certainly.
I'm awfully busy today. One of the waitresses is ill.
I see.
So I'm sort of doing double duty. How about this?
This is fine. Thank you
Grand.
very much.
Sit down and I'll be right back.
All right. Now, when you come to a restaurant, usually somebody shows you what table you're supposed to sit at. And one of the first things you do is to put your napkin either on your lap or up here. And then, well, this is the way a table is set.
So you'll notice very, very different pacing. This is actually slow. It's almost soothing to watch. And what we found was that there was a difference. The educational programs like the Mr. Rogers clip I showed you didn't increase the risk of attentional problems at all. The risk of entertainment shows like Powerpuff Girls movie increased it by 60%, and violent television, which I didn't show you, increased it by over 100%. Now, there's a limit to what we can do with humans in the lab. I can't take babies and force them to watch hours of fast TV. So we've developed a mouse model. That's mouse TV. We take baby mice and we put them in these chambers and they watch television, if you will. They're hearing that, and there's photorhythmic sensors that play flash the lights around. And we have them watch television, if you will, 6 hours a day for 42 days. That's the mouse's entire life, childhood, I should say, watching TV. And then we assess their behavior. And I'll show you one of the ways we assess it. We assess activity and risk-taking. And we do that with what's called the open field test. And the way this works is we put a mouse in a black box, and we see what it does. Now, mice typically will avoid an open field. They're scared of it. They have very few friends in the natural world, and they'll prefer to stay around the perimeter. And we exploit the fact that we have a white mouse on a black background. We have an optic tracker stationed above, and it tells us how the mouse moves. And you'll see on the left, that's the mouse you were just looking at. It spends most of its time on the periphery. But the mouse on the right, you'll notice, is really hyperactive, moving a lot more, and spending much more time in the center. And in fact, what we find is if you compare time in center and entries into the center between mice that watched television all their childhood and those that did not, there are significant differences in both. We also notice differences in their brain structures. So you see control and overstimulated mice, and when we stain them, we see that there's much more brain growth in the control mice compared to the overstimulated, which might not make sense to you. You might think all that stimulation would promote connections, but it actually has the opposite effect because it's unnatural. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what's called joint attention, because it's a very important part of this brain development and one of the things that media interrupts. Joint attention is two people, in this case an adult and a child, focusing on something together. It begins with them looking at each other, as you can see there. Beginning at 4 to 6 months of age, a parent or a caregiver can direct an infant's attention to something. They will look at it and then instantly turn back and look at their caretaker, implicitly saying, "What is that? Tell me something about it." And there will be an exchange. Beginning at about 10 to 12 months of age, as you can see in the upper right there, babies can initiate joint attention. They'll point to something, get the parent to look at it, and they'll look back. This happens hundreds of times a day. It's quite natural, and it's incredibly important, not just to children's social development, but to their cognitive development. So what is the impact of media on this? Well, several years ago, we used something called the Lena system. It's a little digital language processor, which you can see is worn in a vest. It records everything that is heard there, and then there's a very sophisticated software program that can analyze what's being heard. And I'm very pleased to say this has actually been validated in Arabic. And in fact, I was at the Qatar Brain Research Institute, and they're interested in looking at it as a way of detecting autism early. Now, the analysis we do here is what's called conditional regression. We compare times when a child can hear a TV to times when they cannot. And what we look to see is how many words they actually hear. What we found was that when a child hears television, they hear 656 fewer adult female words and 200 fewer adult male words. Now, how many words does a typical adult female say in an hour? 700. So there's about a 90% displacement. When a baby is hearing television, they hear 90% fewer words from an adult female. And how many words does a typical adult male say in an hour? I'm not going to ask anyone to answer that. It's not what you think. The typical adult male says 710 words. So actually, men and women talk just as much. Doesn't mean they listen to each other, but they say the same number of words. The difference here is that women talk to babies more than men talk to babies, and that's why you're seeing a difference in the displacement. Now, I mention all of this because this study looked at television, but of course today there are many other things that distract us from talking to our children. In fact, the technologies we all rely on, as illustrated here, take away those precious conversational turns. And many parents think that they can be on their cell phone and still engaging their child, but they're not going to have the same back and forth. Okay, so in conclusion, I hope I've convinced you that early childhood for children, and for mice, if you care about mice, is critical to their development. And children need more real-time play and less fast-paced media. Because I firmly believe if you change the beginning, you change the whole story. Thank you very much. Shukra.
Thank you. And now we will start with the Q&A session. And until we receive questions from the audience, I will start with some questions of my own. So, first question. You had stated that some children are more sensitive to the fast-paced media. There is a genetic component. However, as parents, as many of us are, how would we identify perhaps a child of ours that's more sensitive to this?
It's an excellent question. And the truth is that, in fact, some kids who are predisposed to having shorter attention are probably drawn to the fast pacing. In fact, many of the parents of kids who I care for with ADHD say, my son can focus on a video game for hours. How can they have attentional problems? The whole point of executive function is not focusing on something that you like. It's focusing on something that you don't like. When I was in medical school, I had to learn all the bones of a hand. It was the most boring thing I've ever done in my life, especially because I had absolutely no interest in hands, no interest in becoming an orthopedic surgeon, but I had to spend that time learning it. That's the key part of executive function. It's giving your child the ability to stay focused on something that they don't like. Now, to answer your question, I firmly believe that what we have to do is try to give every child the ability to maximize whatever genetic ability they have to pay attention, and it clearly varies. But everything you do early in life will make that difference and ultimately may help them learn something as boring as all the bones in the hand, unless they want to become a hand surgeon, in which case I'm sure they'll find it fascinating.
I remember those days, but...
That's right. Could you name one of them now?
No. In regards to treating children differently,
Yes.
Some parents, even people, say that you should treat all of your children the same, even in terms of the attention that you give them, in terms of the books they read, et cetera, et cetera. Are you a proponent of this? Or, as you said, should we perhaps tailor it? I shouldn't say different, but tailor it to the child's needs.
So I'm a little reluctant to answer this question because my children are in the audience, so I have to be very careful what I say. I think the reality is that children are different, and I think one of the challenges of being a parent is modulating how you interact with them to optimize their own development. Now, that said, they're extremely perceptive, and they will be very quick to point out that you aren't treating them the same. So if you choose not to do so, I think you have to have in your own mind a very compelling rationale for why, at least one that you can convince them if you choose to do that. I believe that there are situations where children should be treated differently, but I don't think that should be around things like early exposure. I think there's certain rules of a house that should be consistently applied regardless of the individual child, and clearly that will vary what those are household to household. We certainly had some in ours.
There's some physicians and psychologists that would argue with you and say that actually the digital age gives us more tools to educate our children, more modalities to get their focus. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I've heard that a lot, and I guess my point is that we want our adults of the future to be able to focus on something intently, to give it their full attention. You know, one of the things I hear a lot is this phenomenon of multitasking, and I hear many people say to me, kids these days multitask, and they might as well start as a child. The truth is that one of the myths about multitasking is that you can simultaneously process two things. The truth is that our brain is not capable of doing that. What it does is it oscillates from one activity to the other. And the young, nimble brain is able to do that very, very quickly. But it comes as a cost. Many studies have shown that their performance goes down when they multitask. They don't do as well. And even worse, they don't develop the capacity to focus on one thing. So there are going to be times when today's children grow up where we absolutely want them to give their undivided attention to an important problem before them and not be simultaneously checking their Twitter feed or their Facebook or emailing. They need to develop the capacity to stay fully dedicated. I firmly believe that.
So from the audience, there is a question in regards to, have you noticed any differences in the functions of brains in terms of child's abilities between cultures, nationalities, or even countries?
Oh, that's a great question. It's not research that I've done personally. Some people have tried to look at it. The biggest challenge is that there's so many other things that vary along with country that make it very, very difficult to separate out the effects of culture alone versus climate versus familial structure versus socioeconomic status. But my personal feeling is that there is no difference in brain function. There's certainly no difference in innate neuronal ability. How culture and early experiences affect it obviously matter, and that's kind of one of the points I'm making here. So a culture or a country that makes it routine for children to watch tons of fast-paced media in childhood, over the long term, I would argue, will not fare as well.
So if we could have a more specific question here. For children, at specifically those ages you mentioned that are more sensitive to the media, what can parents do specifically for these children to help shield them or, let's say, minimize the negative effects of media?
So speaking about early childhood, as we have tonight, the American Academy of Pediatrics, which I'm a member of the executive committee on media for, or was, drafted guidelines that said that children of the age of 2 should avoid screen time. After I stepped off that committee, I became very critical of the recommendation because I think it's not consistent with the science, and it's based entirely on passive media and a lot of the research that we've done in my lab around fast-paced media. I think the interactive media that children use today, iPads and iPhones, is a fundamentally different experience and needs to be viewed differently. But my own advice and the way I raised, Danielle and I raised our children, was that in the first 2 years of life, fast-paced media should be avoided. So that doesn't include, obviously, Skyping with family or relatives. And I would argue, starting at 18 months of age, it would not include slow-paced interactive games. I've drafted the new guidelines, and I'll tell you this, but please don't tell anybody else because it hasn't been published yet. But we will say that starting at 18 months of age, interactive media use in limited amounts is okay. So you heard it first.
Just to tie up to that sentence, there's a question from our audience in regards to the interactive apps that are now out there on iPads and iPhones, and sometimes even in the clinic at my center we see parents give it to their children at various ages. What do you say about these interactive specifically children's apps?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are literally hundreds of thousands of them now, and most of them claim to be educational. Virtually none of them have ever been tested as to whether or not that claim is true. Now, there's one exception that I'm aware of. It's a program called Bedtime Math. It's an app called Bedtime Math. I don't believe it exists in Arabic, but most of you I know speak very good English. And the way Bedtime Math works is that each night it gives a story with some embedded math, and then it has questions. And there's an easy, medium, and hard question. And you read the story with your child, and then you choose the easy, medium, or hard question. And that program, Bedtime Math, has been shown in an experiment with kindergartners and first graders to improve children's math skills and decrease their anxiety, their math anxiety. But one of the things that's interesting about that, if you think about it, is even though it's an app, it's really creating a platform for parents and children to interact with each other. It's different than being a completely passive experience. All that said, we have now done a study, which is yet to be published. It will be submitted next month, which showed that at 18 months of age, even on their own, using high-quality, slow-paced apps, children can learn novel shapes, novel words. So I think, honestly, that judicious use of these apps starting at 18 months of age can have benefits. But I want to put one caveat on that, because even good things need to be used in moderation. And the biggest concern I have with app use in children is the extent to which it can become an obsession and displace other activities that are incredibly important. I like to talk about media as a media diet. So by analogy, if you think about a food diet, carrots are a healthy food. But if you eat a bushel of carrots a day, you almost certainly are not having a healthy diet, because there are other things that you're not eating that you should be eating. So even if you're playing an app that's good, if you're playing it for hours a day, you're not engaging in certain experiences that are incredibly important for your child's development.
So if I may say, everything in moderation.
Everything in moderation. I believe that's an Arabic saying.
Yes, it is. In regards to the negative changes that happen in the child, perhaps developmental delay or ADHD, whatever it may be, is this reversible?
That's an excellent question. So in the case specifically of ADHD, we don't think of the underlying neuronal process as being reversible. We think in terms of creating cognitive behavioral therapeutic approaches that can help older children stay focused. They can study in areas of minimal distraction. There are tools they can learn to use to help them stay focused. And many children, certainly with mild ADHD, can not need any kind of medication and can still do very well in school as they get older. But they have to train themselves. It doesn't change the underlying brain function, but it helps them put overlying strategies that help them modulate it.
Another question is, can we help our children, or can we prevent them from being quote-unquote addicted to video games? Now, this is a question near and dear to my heart.
Yeah. Should I reveal how much video games you play?
No, please don't.
It's a very important question. In fact, in studies that we've done in the U.S. population, about 10 to 12% of college students in the United States have what we call problematic internet use, which is basically bordering on addiction. Now, the reality is that there's something called a dopamine reward pathway, which starts in the back of the brain. It sends a signal to the pleasure center of the brain, and then a signal is sent from there to the prefrontal cortex we were talking about before. And that signal says, I like that. Do that again. Get more of it. It's a healthy pathway. It also reinforces positive behavior. So when you compliment your child, you're activating that dopamine reward pathway and making them think, I want to do that again because I liked the feedback I got. But video games consciously play on that. There are many, many ways. In fact, I can tell you that at Microsoft in my backyard, they employ dozens of cognitive psychologists whose job it is to make the games addictive, to put in features that activate that dopamine reward pathway, that make it very difficult for you to leave. And I can tell you later what some of those strategies are. But I do think parents need to be very mindful of how much time their children spend, because it can easily go from being fun crossing over into addiction. So there are a lot of strategies that parents can employ, but I don't want to spend too much time because I think there are other questions.
Yes, this is kind of a two-parter. The first part is, can you make TV work for you, not against you? And does it matter whether or not it is a certain member of the family that perhaps takes part with the child, the father, the mother, the brother, the sister? Does it matter?
So that's a great two-part question. So the first part of this, absolutely. I didn't talk about that today. I was talking about sort of the negative effects in early childhood. But there's no question that media can be an incredibly positive influence. Now, I'm talking even about watching nature programs on television, Googling things, finding out things that you could never otherwise find. Our children have unbelievable information at their disposal, which is a great thing, inarguably a great thing. The challenge parents face is, how do you keep it as a good thing? How do you get the good and leave behind the bad? As I often say, if media were like cigarettes, it would be easy to say, this is a bad thing, don't do it. But they're not. Media are good and bad. And the challenge parents have is, how do you extract the good without the bad? And there are many ways in which you can do it. It starts, by the way, by being a good example yourself. So what I often tell parents is, you need to have a very clear plan for how you're going to use television or the internet. If you're modeling bad behaviors by just turning on the TV and flipping channels without knowing what you want to watch, if you have it on while you're having dinner, if you pull out your phone when you're talking to your children, you're modeling very, very bad behavior. And of course, children will imitate that and learn from it. The second part to your question is, are there ways in which parents being involved can make it great? Absolutely. That's I think, one of the things, when TV first started as a medium in the 50s, families had one TV. It was centrally located in the house, and they gathered together and watched as a family. Very, very different from the way it is now. The typical family has 2 or 3 televisions. Children have TV in their rooms. Children have TVs in their pockets. And instead of getting together and watching together as a family, increasingly these media pull families apart. They retreat to their rooms, they retreat to their device, and they're not interacting as much. So I, frankly, am very bullish on the idea of using media as a way to get together, whether it's playing a game with your child, watching a soccer match, a football match. All of these things are positive family attributes, but they're not the norm now the way they used to be. It's very, very different.
So one final question. Knowing the statistics that I've mentioned as being really connected to the internet, using a lot of iPhones, iPads, the fast-paced life, and I think this is the place in the UAE where we've witnessed a huge change very quickly. If you could give us one piece of advice, and I know that might be difficult, what is the one biggest piece of advice you would give us in regards to this?
What I ask people to do, what I ask families to do, is to really take stock of how media is impacting their lives. In the experiments we do, in the studies we do with families, we actually ask them to keep a media diary for a week. It's a lot of work, but it really is the best way for you to see how much time are you spending, how much time are your children spending, where are they going, what are they doing. And nowadays, they're actually technological add-ons. They're apps and software that will collect those data for you. Your children may not be pleased if you put it on their phone, but if you do it for a week, you can find out how much time they're spending, what they're doing on it. And that, I think, is the way to start having the conversation with yourself and with your children about how many hours are we spending, and are these really useful hours? Do we really want to be spending 15 hours on Facebook? There was Facebook, I can tell you, has as its plan This is in their business model, that every human on Earth will spend 3 hours a day on Facebook. That's their plan, that's their strategy, and they're working actively to get us there. You can ask yourself now, do you think that you want your child or yourself to spend 3 hours a day on Facebook? Is that a productive use of their time? And if not, you should start building in limits now.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Shukran.
أستأذنك سيدي في ختام المحاضرة. First, I would like to thank His Highness for hosting these informative sessions. I would also like to thank Dr. Christakis for his time and this wonderful presentation, and the audience for their kind attention. In the end, children are our country's future and our true wealth. We must prepare them to take on the challenges that the future may bring. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.